now we're just going to go from the, encouraging news from the legislature down to the nitty-gritty world of property values and tax rate adoption. For those of y'all that are here, this is kind of a sneak peek of what we'll be presenting at the conference later this summer. At that conference, you'll, I think, have your July certified values, hopefully. So bring them with you. If you want, you can send them to me beforehand. I can, right there in front of everybody, we'll do your notice, and you'll be, or not your notice. Well, if you're September 1, you can do your notice. We'll do all your truth and taxation stuff, and then you can go home and be done with it. So if you want to be a guinea pig in front of everybody, send me your stuff in advance of that conference, and we'll use you as an example and walk through some of these things. But if you're a July district, you're out of luck. You got to do it on your own. So hopefully you're already pretty far down the road on that. Of course, you can always reach out and call us, and we'll be glad to help. Okay. All right. Your property values are used in a couple different ways. You can see those listed out here. Then there's different versions of your property values that are used for different purposes. So the first one there, as we know, we talk about tax impression a lot. The first usage that we'll go over is to determine tax compression. You guys should be familiar with this. It's that local property value survey that's administered every summer. You have to take your certified value report, turn that into TEA, and then they tell you what your MCR is. I want to stress that. TEA will tell you what your MCR is. They will tell you what your tier 1 rate is. Do not adopt a rate unless it's built on the tier 1 rate that TEA tells you. Okay. Districts mess this up every year, including some in Region 1. I'm not going to name any names, but people have messed it up in prior years. And so just I don't think anyone in the room, no one in the room. So just be mindful that you have to wait until you get that tier 1 rate, that MCR. I'm going to use those terms interchangeably, really. Until you get that from TEA, from the local property value survey, you take that tier 1 rate, add your tier 2 pennies to that. That is your adopted rate. Okay. Do not use the prior year tier 1 rate or anything else. Use the one you get from the local property value survey. All right. I'll get off my public service announcement now. Okay. Here's, again, just a quick vocab check. Here's what the M&O rate is. There's different components to the M&O rate. Understanding this is crucial because that's how you understand how tax compression works. So we have the tier 1 rate, or tier 1 portion of the rate. That was $1 prior to House Bill 3 in 2019. House Bill 3 put in, of course, this compression scheme in statute, and your tier 1 rate has been going down ever since then. So again, it was $1. Now it's something less than 89 cents, and it's going to go down even more. So that's tier 1. There's tier 1. That formula depends on statewide property value growth and local property value growth. Right now, we don't know your official local property value growth. That comes in July. But we do know the statewide property value compression part of that because that's in the budget. Okay, and again, we'll walk through how to change your template so you can fold all this new information in. Again, the tier 1 rate comes from the local property value survey that you fill out each summer. That is a crucial bit of information that you need for tax rate adoption purposes. All right, so here's just conceptually the similarities and differences between the state compression and the local compression. The state compression is based on the controller's estimate. Local compression, you feed in the values from your July certified report. Both of them are sort of set in the calculation, start providing compression once that exceeds a 2.5% threshold. The statewide compression, you can kind of think of that as the ceiling. Okay, it sets the ceiling, and then it's 90% of that ceiling is the floor, and then local compression can determine if you're somewhere in between those two. Okay, that's how those two things work together. Yes. Yeah. Right. Yeah, I should have meant, yeah, I was, and we'll talk about tier 2 in a little bit, but um, this is just an example up here. Not every one of y'all in the room will have 17 cents in tier 2. Only those that have gone for a TRE after House Bill 3 would have 17 cents. If you have gone for a TRE prior to House Bill 3, and nothing else since then, let's say before House Bill 3, you're up to the full $1.17. Your 17 cents now is 0.1383. Okay, so we'd have to shave off some of those copper pennies there for you. But yeah, so this is just an example showing all the various tiers and everything. Yeah, I think not a whole lot of districts have done a TRE since House Bill 3. So I think maybe a dozen, 2 dozen, I think, statewide have the full 17. So most of y'all don't have 17 cents there. But we'll talk about tier 2 compression here later on. Oh, this one. That's a great question. We're going to get there. Yeah. So you can see the state. So we have the controller estimate. That's one value that needs to get plugged in. The state also has to look at the prior biennium. They look at everybody that had been compressed down to that 90% floor. The state saves money by having that compression floor. And so what House Bill 3 required is, it says the legislature has to look at all the savings that they had during the last biennium because of those districts that were sort of propped up by that floor, calculate that savings, and then use that money to bring down the ceiling the next session for everybody. Okay, that amount was the 5.3 billion we talked about. Current law compression, when I was presenting with Amy earlier, that 5.3 equates to 8.25 cent reduction. So they're bringing that ceiling last in 22-23 was 89.41. They're going to bring that down by an additional 8.25 pennies. Okay, and here in a second I'll show you where in your template you enter all this stuff in, and that way you can know how this is impacting you. So that 90% that I talked about, this is this last year, 22-23 school year, we had 700 districts at that 90% floor. That floor this past year was 80.46. So if you're at 80.46, you were contributing, you're one of the 701 districts, you were contributing to that $5.3 billion that the state saved. And then you are also contributing to bringing the ceiling down for everybody else in the state. So thank you for your service. We appreciate that. You are providing tax relief for everybody across the state, essentially. And so part of this whole provision is so that we don't get a bunch of districts sort of clumped together at the floor. This was a problem during 22-23. The legislature is trying to prevent this from happening. And so that's one reason why that provision is in statute. This is from last year. You guys have not obviously submitted the local property value survey for 23, but you can see on the last administration of that survey, we had 17.3% year-over-year growth. I would imagine it would probably be less than that this time around, but I was digging through our old slides and saw this and thought it was interesting. You can see some really strong growth out in the region 18 with the mineral values. Region 1 rather was below the state average, but still double-digit growth across the state. Oh, except for region 5. Region 5, They had some slow growth there out in East Texas. The average MCR says, this is after the last administration of the survey. Region 1 had an average tier 1 of 82.55, a little bit higher than the state average of 81.86. And so here's what Jaime was just asking. What is the ceiling? So this slide shows the sort of history of the ceiling. The first year of House Bill 3, it was 93 cents. They took that dollar, went to 93 cents. There was no local compression in the first year of House Bill 3. It was too complicated. They had to wait a year to figure all that out. Then that 93 went to 91.64, 91.34, 89.41. We had local compression kick in during the 2021 school year. Then in 23-24, these are the new, once you plug in everything in the budget, this is what you get. So I plugged in the new controller estimate of 4.43 cents of 4.43% value growth. I plugged in the 0.0825 in additional compression that we just talked about. And building off the prior year, that yields 79.50. Okay, so that dollar that we started with at prior to House Bill 3 has now been compressed all the way down to 79.50. Next year, the controller estimated 2.87% growth. You can see that's just a sliver above the 2.5% threshold in statute. So we just get a little sliver of compression next year. Okay, so again, this is just the ceiling, right? I want to stress that this is the ceiling. Your mileage may vary, right? If you have additional property value growth, your tier 1 rate may not be this, okay? If you're a July 1 district and you're doing your notice, you're going to want to build that rate in your notice based on 79.50, okay? Because you don't know your local compression yet. And we're going to talk more about that later on, but we do know what state compression is doing to you, right? Last year, for 22-23, you couldn't have been lower than 80.46. And so you're going to at least get compressed down to 79.50. Then if you have additional local value growth, then you could be somewhere south of that. Okay, so again, 79.50 is a ceiling. The floor would be 71.55. Okay, so that's sort of the brackets. That's the sandbox we have to play in for tax rates. And then local compression can take you anywhere within there. Okay, so those are the bookends we know now. In July, when you get your certified values, we'll see where you are within that. Okay, questions about that? This is set, yeah. I mean, one tiny little asterisk on this is the governor could, if he wakes up in a bad mood or something, he could veto Article 3 of the budget, right? I mean, there's crazy things could happen, but this is essentially set, yeah. We'll put out a notice once this happens, but once the governor signs the budget, then it's set, okay? So right now, the budget, as we mentioned earlier, is at the controller's office. The controller's got to give his green light, and then the governor will sign it. Okay, so again, this just kind of visualizes that how this is going to work this year. So you can see the prior. This is just an example district for 22-23. Their prior year tier 1 rate was 80.46. We know. Does this have a laser thingy? Let's see. Oh, there we go. Fancy. All right. You can see they were at 80.46. They're going to come down at least to 79.50, right? So if you're a July 1, you know you're going to be here at least, okay? So when you're putting out your notice, you can start with 79.50, then add your tier 2 pennies. That's your proposed M&O rate for purposes of the budget. Or I'm sorry, for purposes of the notice, yeah. Because again, we don't know how far down here you're going to go until you get your July values, okay? So for July 1 districts, we ignore all of this and just say, we think we're going to be at least here, okay? And then in July, once the certified values come in, we'll know how far down we go here, okay? Okay, so how is this growth calculated? I'm going to sort of skip over this. You guys know it's on the local property value survey. It opens in mid-July, closes in August 1. You have 10 days to appeal. Hopefully everyone gets it right the first time and we don't have to appeal. Sometimes your CAD throws you a curveball and they give you the July certified values, and then a week later they say, whoops, there was a mistake and we forgot a parcel or whatever it was, right? And so then you could potentially get more compression if they do that, right? Or maybe less. It kind of depends on what kind of mistake your CAD made. But hopefully there's no mistakes, and so you don't have to appeal. But you do have a sort of a small window, 10 days, 10-day window to appeal. And then your tier 1 rate, your MCR is finalized at the end of August, and then gets rolled into the summary finance following February. Okay, so here's all the information you need to enter into local property value survey. You have to enter in previous year and current year. And so we always go certified to certified. Okay, so get your July 25th certified values from the prior year, the certified values from the current year, and we'll pluck some of these data points from those two reports. All right, and so this is what that module looks like. You have to log into the FSP to look at that. It's again called Local Property Value Survey. Some of these things will be pre-populated. The prior year local optional homestead exemption, if this applies to you, I think only about a third of districts have a local optional homestead exemption. So for most of y'all, this will not apply. That first field there, you're going to have a 0 here. But this district they did adopt a local optional homestead exemption, so they have some value loss there. It's going to pre-populate your controller number, your T2 from tax year 22, and it's going to pre-populate the data you entered in last year on the local property value survey. Okay. Yes, and it as I said, it pre-populates that controller T2 from the state property value study. Those first three should be ready to go once you log in. This first one is one you have to enter from your July certified report. All right, and I'll show you where to find that. So just conceptually, and I think Hidalgo and Cameron both use the versions of the report that I'm going to show here. Just like you guys districts have different student information systems, CADs also have different property value report systems. So your county may not use the exact report that I have up here. So I just want to give you kind of a big picture conceptual understanding of what kind of number you're looking for to put in, again, that field. It needs to be grand total, your grand total value. And by that, I mean, you don't need to have ARB approved, or it needs to be ARB approved plus the values under protest. So the grand total, we don't need to differentiate if it's under protest or not. Okay, so again, grand total, that's what we're looking for. Next up is net taxable. Okay, and by that I mean not freeze adjusted, right? So on your reports, you'll see taxable values, freeze adjusted values. Freeze adjusted just means they take all those over 65 and disabled properties and remove all of the value from that. Okay, we don't want to do that for the purposes of this. We want net taxable. So that's prior to the removal of any frozen values. Okay, we also want M&O, right? For those of you that have 313, you know there's a differentiation between your M&O and INS values. Ignore the INS one. We just want the M&O value for this purpose. All right, so this is what that report looks like for at least all of y'all in Hidalgo and Cameron. I know those two CADs use this kind of report. I know there's other districts in Region 1 where this is not the case. If you're having trouble finding this, reach out to me and I'll help you out. But for this district, you can see they have a 313. And so they have two different taxable values. They have an M&O and an INS. Quick note, is anyone in here a 313 district? Anyone have 313s? Anyone in Zoom have 313s? I'll move on past that. But if you do have 313s and you have questions about that, reach out. But if you have a 313, make sure that you have 2 different values. If you don't, that means your CAD messed something up. They do that pretty regularly. They forget to do your 313 stuff. And so check for this. Is the first flag that should go up if you're a 313 and you don't see that. At any rate, for everybody, you just need the M&O version of that number. If you don't have a 313, your report looks like this. It doesn't differentiate between M&O and INS, just as net taxable. Okay, so again, 3 things you want to look for. You want to look for certified totals at the top. You want to look for grand totals subhead. Grand totals, again, means it's not just ARB approved, right? It's ARB approved plus values under protest. That's what grand totals indicates. And then you want to look for it net taxable, M&O net taxable. Okay, so those are the 3 markers of that should sort of help you hone in on the correct value to use. All right, once you find that, you plug that in here. Excuse me. All right, then if you are a 313 or you have an expiring 313 or expiring 311 limitation, you will enter things in here. This is going to apply to very, very few districts. So I'm going to move through this pretty quickly. Again, this is only those, if you have a 313 and it's not expiring, you can also ignore this. This is only for those that have an expiring 313 or 311 limitation. Okay, you had it in 22 and it's expiring in 23. Okay, if you think this applies to you, come see me after class. We'll talk about it. All right, most people are going to have 2 zeros here. Next up, you need to find local optional homestead exemption. All right, again, as I mentioned, 2/3 of districts across the state are going to have a 0 here. So probably most of y'all are going to have a 0. And the way to confirm, or I guess let me talk about conceptually here real quick. One thing that districts always mess up on this is they get confused between the local optional homestead exemption, which you adopt, districts adopt this. They confuse that with the mandated state homestead exemption, right? This is the 40K, they're talking about taking up to 100K. A couple years ago, it was 25K. All right, this is not what we're talking about here. We're talking about the local optional homestead exemption that districts adopt. It's a percentage-based exemption, okay? A district can adopt anywhere from 0 to 20%, and you can do that, I think, by July. So if you want to do that, you have time to do that. I think the deadline for that is the end of July, but it essentially works the same way as the homestead, the state homestead, except instead of a flat dollar amount, you can take a percentage off the resident homesteads in your district. I would particularly, if you're a recapture district, this may be something to look at because you get adjustments to your recapture that kind of takes some of the sting out of this out. But if you're not a recapture district, the state does not recognize this for your T2, right? So when the state goes to calculate your T2, all this value here is still on the books. Okay, so it essentially counts against you for funding purposes. This is what I'm talking about here: local optional homestead exemption. You can find that by going again to your certified total report. Again, we're looking for grand totals. This is the exemption breakdown page. You find the homestead row of that, find the local column. If you have a 0 here, then you don't have a local optional homestead exemption. This district has some value loss there, so they do have a local optional homestead exemption. Oops. Wire here. There we go. Whatever value you do have there, you put that in this field. Again, most of y'all are going to have 0, and then really that's it. So this property value survey is not super complicated once you kind of know what to look for, and then enter that in. this is your preliminary MCR. Okay, so if you think back to my public service announcement at the start of this thing, don't adopt your tier 1 rate until you get this number, right? This is your preliminary MCR. You're going to submit that again. That hopefully you do this around August 1st. You have 10 days to appeal it again in case your CAD comes back and says, "Whoops, we forgot something. This should have been, $100 million higher," or whatever it was. Right? Then you can go in and appeal and change what's on the local property value survey. And so this number, again, the preliminary version is August 1st. The final version you should get, I think, August 11th, somewhere in there, mid-August. So I would encourage you guys to wait to adopt your rate until you get the final MCR, if that's possible. I know some of y'all like to adopt earlier in August. That's okay. Just know that if your CAD comes back with a revised report and you've already adopted, and maybe you could have gotten more tax compression, you're kind of missing out on that, right? If your CAD again comes back and says your values, we thought they were here, but now they're actually higher, that could have generated some more tax compression. But if you've already adopted, then you can't sort of pass that tax compression onto the voters. All right. All right. Of course, if your district spans multiple counties, make sure to go to all the counties, the certified total reports, and add those numbers together for purposes of filling out this survey. Also, he stepped out, of course, the slide I had prepared for him. Once you get this, once you get this tier 1 rate, once you get your tier 1 rate, you'll have to take some notes on. Once you get this tier 1 rate, you'll add your tier 2 pennies to that, and then that is the rate you adopt for the next school year. Okay. All right, you're back now that I just missed this slide. All right. Yeah, we're going to talk about tier 2, so I'll get them caught up. Okay, so here's how this has kind of played out so far. So again, that first dollar before House Bill 3 passed has been compressed down to 93 cents. This district had 17 cents before House Bill 3. Okay, they got compressed down to 13.83. Right, so you add to get your total tax rate, your tier 1 rate plus tier 2 is total. Okay. This 93 was uniform for everybody in the first year of House Bill 3. All right, this example district, again, this is just an example. They didn't see a lot of property value growth, so they just moved down with the state ceiling. They went from 93 cents to 91.64. No compression in tier 2. So those 13.83 pennies just shift over, just float on down on top of the tier 1 rate for a total rate for this district of $1.0547. Fast forwarding a little bit, not a whole lot of reduction in the ceiling in tax year 21. And this district, again, was pretty slow growing, this example district, so they just moved with the ceiling. They went from 91.64 to 91.34. Again, no compression in tier 2, right? They didn't go for a TRE or do any disaster pennies or anything, so they still have the same 0.1383 tier 2 pennies. Those, again, just float down on top of your total tier 1 rate. The tier 1 tax rate for the 22-23 school year was 89.41. Sorry, tier 1 was 89.41. This is the ceiling. Okay, again, same story. You add the 13.83, and you can see the total rate is going down because that ceiling is going down. Your tier 1 rate's going down. Again, most districts, more than 700 districts, their tier 1 rate is less than that. It's 80 cents. Okay, so but again, this slide is just showing you how these pieces fit together, right? The tier 2 rate, unless you're going for a TRE or they increase the basic allotment, or you do disaster pennies, it's going to be the same as what you had last year. Okay, and that just floats down right on top of tier 1 to get your total tax rate. All right, here's the bit that we talked about earlier. 89.41. The new 89.41 is now 79.50. This is the new ceiling. So everybody's tier 1 rate is going to be 79.50 or lower, right? Between 79.50 or 71.55. But the basic mechanics work the same. You take tier 1, add your tier 2 pennies, and then that's your total tax rate, right? So there should not be a district in the state, except for 2 in the Houston area, but we're going to ignore them. There should not be a district in the state that has an M&O rate higher than 0.9333 this year when they adopt the rate in 23-24. If you're getting something like this in your template that's higher than this, you're doing something wrong. All right, give me a call. Here's in your template where you can go to make sure that you're not goofing this up, okay? It's the Calc Data tab, okay? Omar likes to have a million tabs. The Calc Data one is relatively easy to find, but sort of in the middle of that page, these are the numbers you need to plug in, okay? This is not what they say now, okay? The red indicates I have changed something. This is not what it says now. So you put, this is the controller estimate for 23-24. This is the controller estimate for 24-25. They're in the GAA, in the state budget, but I've entered them in here for you. So it's 4.43 percentage growth for this year, 2.87 this year. Plug those two in, and then remember all those districts at the 90% floor last year, and the state saved some money thanks to that 90% floor. You can look at this 0.0825 with some pride, know that your district contributed to that. Again, thank you for your service there. This gets added in, and that you plug all those 3 numbers in, and your template should get 79.50. Okay. As the ceiling. Again, that's the ceiling. Your mileage may vary. You could be lower than that, but you definitely can't be higher than that. All right, now we're going to get to tier 2 compression. So again, back to our tax rate vocab lesson here. We talked about tier 1, how that compression works. This shows 17 cents in tier 2. Most of y'all don't have 17 pennies. You're going to have 13.83. So I'm going to chop you off right around there, but you'll have this section if you've done a TRE prior to House Bill 3. But I'm just showing all the pennies here so you understand sort of the possibilities here. A district can have up to 8 golden pennies. The first, I'm going to phrase that differently. The first 8 pennies of tier 2 are golden pennies. They're called golden because they are more valuable to you. They have a higher guaranteed yield. This is the part that when I talk about that yield going up from $98.56 to $126.21. These are the pennies that are, so they were golden pennies. Now they're even more golden, right? They're even more valuable because that yield has gone up for the 23-24 school year. There's never any compression for golden pennies in statute. So no matter what happens, golden pennies are not compressed. Copper pennies can get compressed. We saw that when House Bill 3 passed, okay? They are compressed whenever the basic allotment is increased, okay? So, because of that, the yield for copper pennies is also tied to the basic allotment. So that compression combined with the yield increase makes that revenue neutral, okay? So you're not getting hurt in copper pennies by a basic allotment increase, okay? It keeps that entitlement steady, right? So the compression offsets the increase in the yield. So your entitlement for copper pennies is still the same if they increase the basic allotment. That makes sense? Right, yeah. So the copper pennies, the question was, even though the pennies are being reduced, does it stay the same? And the answer is yes, because the copper pennies become more valuable when the basic allotment is increased, right? So right now the yield is $49.28, $49.28. If they increase the basic allotment, that could go up to $50, let's say, right? If it goes up, the yield goes up, the number of pennies shrinks a little bit. Okay, so that way on a net basis, when you put all that together, the entitlement is the same for copper pennies. Okay, so just know, let's say, by the grace of God, during a special session coming up, Governor Abbott, he calls a school funding special session next week. and he increases the basic allotment by $1,000. I don't know. Let's be optimistic here. Then that would trigger copper penny compression. Okay, so just know that if you hear the basic allotment's gone up and you haven't adopted your tax rate yet, know that you need to make an adjustment to your copper pennies. Okay, do not adopt your tax rate without adjusting your copper pennies, because that means you're going to get a nasty letter from TEA. They're going to say you did it wrong, and they're going to there'll be some not great implications for your summary of finance. Okay, so yeah. Yes. Yeah. So these labels, sort of colloquially, we refer to them as golden pennies because they're more valuable, copper pennies because they are less valuable. But in statute, they're referred to as tier 2 level 1 is golden, tier 2 level 2 is copper. And so you'll see that on your summary of finance as well. Okay, so yeah, just to reiterate, basic allotment goes up. Hopefully that happens during a special session. That means copper pennies will be compressed, okay? So you need to make sure you do an adjustment to that and include that in your adopted tax rate. All right, so here's that same slide I showed earlier, but with the copper pennies sort of interaction. Here's what happened with House Bill 3. They took one copper penny, moved it over to golden, and reduced the remaining copper pennies by almost 65%. Where the heck 65% come from? Well, that's the change in the yield between before House Bill 3 and after House Bill 3, right? Before House Bill 3, it was 31.95. House Bill 3 took up to 49.28. And so you do that math, that's 64, almost 65%. That is the factor that gets applied to your remaining copper pennies. So remember, let's say House Bill 3, you had 17 cents, you did a TRE prior to House Bill 3. They took one of those pennies, moved it over to golden. That left nine copper pennies. I'm sorry, that left 8, right? No, that left 9. Yeah, that left 9 copper pennies. They compressed that 9 down by 65% by multiplying that by 65%. I think I did that right. Oh, I got that slide twice. Sorry. Oh, this just says the basic allotment. Yeah, if the basic allotment goes up, they're going to do this calculation all over again. Okay. Okay, this just continues that. Again, unless this does it, your tier 2 does not change unless a number of things happen. 1, they increase the basic allotment, that triggers copper penny compression. 2, you do a TRE, right? You go to the voters and ask for more tier 2 pennies. Or 3, you do disaster pennies, and that only increases your tier 2 rate for 1 year, okay, temporarily, okay? The copper penny compression, the basic allotment increase, and an election, that increases it going forward, okay? Disaster pennies is only sort of a 1 year bump. All right, so that is how to get your values ready for, or how your values impact tax compression. That was the first third of the presentation. All right, we're going to keep on trekking. We also use our values for determining state aid, right? You guys see the T2 on your summary of finance. That comes from your, ideally, unless you get in trouble with the controller's office, that comes from your CAD, right? Your CAD reports data to the controller. The controller evaluates that data, makes sure that they're not sort of arbitrarily keeping values low in your county. If the controller gives you a green light, then they use the CAD data to determine your T2, which determines your local share for tier 1 and tier 2. All right, so this one's a little bit more complicated. It looks pretty innocent here, pretty simple. This formula to use your CAD report to calculate your T2, but there's some wrinkles on some of those items that we'll talk about now. So the first one's easy, the M&O net taxable. That is here. We talked about that earlier, right? This is part of what you need for the local property value survey. So you should know how to find it. The first piece, again, is that M&O net taxable. And again, we're trying to calculate our T2 here. So we're going to use the M&O. If you don't have a 313, again, you don't have a separate, it's not separated, it's just net taxable. All right, so we found that number, we plug that in here. The next thing we have to do to calculate T2, and again, this is sort of the Moat-KC shorthand way to do a T2. The controller does a much more involved process, but we don't need to, this is gonna get you 97% of the way there. We don't need to really worry about the other details. Okay, so we have our M&O net taxable plugged in. The frozen value loss is the next one. This one's kind of a doozy, so stay with me here. Actually, I'm sorry, I misspoke. The one thing you may want to look at before you do the frozen piece is sometimes your CAD will tell you, we think we may lose some protests, right? You're going to get your July values, and there may be some outstanding protests still at that time. Your CAD will communicate to you, here's the amount of parcels that are being protested. Here's where we think it may shake out. All right. So with this report, they only had one parcel, one taxpayer protesting. Okay, at the time of the July certified values. I'd imagine most of y'all, if you look at your certified values on this page, the under ARB review subhead, you're going to see more than one property there. But you can see the taxable value for this property was 2.98 million. Okay. Later on in the report, they have this page that says lower value used. Okay. Here's that same market value. So they say, here's what the CAD thinks it's worth, right? Here's what, maybe if we lose the protest, what could happen, right? So this taxpayer is arguing over, $60,000, right? And so this is what the CAD has plugged in as an estimate for what potentially could happen if that protest is lost. So if you have a big difference between these two numbers on your report, right, that could indicate your CAD's anticipating potential losses from those protested values. So you may want to find that difference between these two and shave off some from this amount. Okay, if you want to sort of reflect your T2 estimate or have your T2 estimate reflect what your CAD is telling you. All right, so that's the protest stuff. Moving on to frozen value loss, that it relies on some information at the bottom of your grand totals page. These are all your frozen values, over 65 frozen, disabled frozen. That's what you will need to draw some of this information from. If you have a local optional homestead exemption, we talked about that earlier, and you want to do all this T2 calculation, you need to also ask for the freeze totals report, okay? Because that has your local optional homestead loss for your frozen properties, and that's an important factor to include in this calculation. So you can see this district, they have a local optional homestead, again, because we go to local, we go to homestead, and they also have some other local exemptions for their over 65 folks. Again, these are all optional. You don't have to do any of these. If you have the zeros all up and down here, then you don't need to worry about anything. Here is how to calculate all that. So again, you grab the taxable value from the recap page. We saw that here, taxable value, 13.6. I'm going to skip over that one for a sec. You get your tax rate for the next school year. So this should actually be 23, 24. You could scratch that, but get your tax rate, where you think your tax rate is going to be. Then you're going to calculate your levy. All right. You just take your value divided by 100 times your rate. That gets sort of what your over 65 and disabled people would have paid if they didn't get that exemption. This number is what those folks are actually going to pay, right? Because again, they have a frozen levy, right? So they're not going to pay what they nominally should. They're going to pay at this reduced frozen amount, and you can find that here under actual tax. This is the amount that your CAD is saying all those over 65 and disabled homeowners, they're going to pay that amount. All right, so you plug that in there. This is the levy loss. This is the difference between calculated levy and actual levy for those over 65 and disabled folks. And then you back into a value amount. So this is the levy loss. What value does that correspond with given our tax rate? And you can see my little calculation there. This is where all that information from that freeze totals report comes from, and you put that in down here. Again, these are the local disability exemptions, local over 65, local over 65 spouse. You take all this value, and that is a difference between these two numbers here. Okay, so you started with this 13.6 you got from your recap report. You add back any of the local exemptions you have, okay? And then you do that same calculation, okay? All right, and just because I'm a nerd and I want to prove to y'all that all this, this hocus pocus actually works, here's a district. I've pulled their, those same tables from their reports. You can see that the taxable actual tax, you can see they have some local exemptions. We're going to plug all that into this set of calculations here. And so given the 23 certified report that this district gave me, I would have predicted that their value loss would have been 27.8 million. Okay, that's in July. All right, fast forward to the following. Oh yeah. Also, make sure to grab those exemptions from the freeze total report, because you're going to get a different number. If you don't plug that in, instead of 27.8, this district would have got 8.4, which is not correct. All right, so if you do have these, make sure to get your freeze totals report from your CAD if you want to do this calculation. All right, so again, I would have predicted 27.8 in July. Fast forward to the following January, and look at that. We're pretty close there, right? The local value is 27. We'll call it 27.8. Okay, so this is the number that we need to calculate to do your T2. That the way the controller does, and this screenshot here is from the property value study report that the controller puts out. Okay, so this is the kicker. This is what we were trying to calculate with those formulas on the previous slide. All right, and so that's what you need to do your T2. So you get that number, and again, I'm going back to my first example. Their version of that was 20.7 million. So I have my M&O net taxable, potentially adjusted for any protest loss. I have my frozen value loss that we just calculated. And then if you have a local optional homestead exemption, you have to add that value back in, because the controller doesn't care about your local optional homestead exemption. You don't get any adjustment for that for T2 purposes, okay? So you need to go find out what that is and add that back, okay? Because your CAD's gonna take it out. Your CAD takes those local optional homestead exemption value loss out, like you can't tax on it, but the state, when they're calculating your state aid and your recapture, they ignore the value you took off the rolls for local optional homestead exemption, right? So you got to add that back in for T2 purposes.
Going back to the previous 2 slides where you have the whole calculation, is it another one there? So on the total calculated levy, do you recommend doing like a 96% of collections or 98% or anything like?
So this is levy. It's
Oh,
100%.
levy.
100%.
So you don't have that collection there, right? Like the
No,
total
so again,
collections.
for the purposes of this is what the controller does. Okay, so this is not, we'll get to how to calculate collections here in a moment. This is just how the controller comes up with this number, right? That shows up on the property value study. If I go look, like I can find all these other numbers in the CAD report. Like the CAD told Controller Hager, this district lost 45.9 million on the state mandated, right? The CAD told them this. The CAD didn't tell them this, right? That's not on any CAD report, right? That's why we have to go do all these crazy calculations I just went through, okay? It's based on this information that the CAD did tell the controller, okay? So the controller takes these little bits of information, does this calculation and says, okay, this is the freeze loss we're going to use for the property value study, okay?
But so I guess would that matter when you calculate the tax rate though? Like when I'm just envisioning when you're doing
so
Omar's template.
the first thing you got to do is calculate your rate. And I'm sorry, scratch that. This is, I repurposed the slides from last year. This should say your tax rate for 23-24. Yeah, so it's your current tax rate. So first you got to do the compression, figure out what your tax rate is, and then you can do this T2 stuff, right? But it's kind of a dynamic thing, right? You got to do your tax rate to do your T2. Okay. All right, so we got net taxable adjusted for protest. We got our freeze loss. Now we got to go hunt for our local optional homestead exemption. Again, we go to the exemption breakdown page, look for a homestead row, local column. 2/3 of y'all, I think it's probably more than that in region 1. Most of y'all in region 1 are not going to have anything here, but this district does. They have a local optional homestead, and that optional homestead is making the district lose 26.5 million in value. It's taken 26.5 million off the rolls. Okay, so that's where you can find that on your report. You take that, plug that in there. Voila, you have a T2. Okay, that would be I think there's a way more complicated way to do it, but this is going to get you guys really, really, really close, and it's going to be good enough for forecasting purposes. So that's how I would recommend putting together your T2 for entering into the template. Again, I have some other things here. You can do deferral loss. If you have a TIF, talk to me and we can. I don't think anyone in region 1 has a TIF, so you don't have to worry about that. But there's other little wrinkles if those apply, but for most of y'all, it's not. Of course, that same caveat I mentioned earlier, if you are spanning multiple CADs, you get the privilege of doing all this twice. And also, this is just your local T2, right? This is your T2 as your CAD would calculate it. It's your T2 based on data your CAD provided. You may get state values assigned. All of y'all in Cameron County know this well. You're going through this process now where you did get state values assigned, right? The controller looked at all this data that the CAD sent them, said, no, that's too low. They're fudging the numbers down there. And they came back and increased it, okay? And I know Cameron County, they're protesting. I think you guys have gotten results from some of those protests. I don't think you were fully successful, but I think it's going to keep on winding its way through the protest system. So we'll see how that all shakes out. But just want to make sure everyone's aware conceptually of what's going on. Everything I just talked about, that's the local version of your T2. And I think probably 80% of districts, I guess probably 90% of districts, their local values were certified, right? But some of, for about 10%, they weren't. Okay, so just be aware that you could get state values assigned, then your T2 is going to be different. Okay, it's going to be higher. Okay, and there's really no way to really predict that. If your CAD has a history of getting in trouble with the controller's office, then you may want to sort of plan for that that possibility. I don't think Cameron County has a long history of getting dinged by the property value study. And some of those preliminary, the 23 preliminary results show some pretty big gains, pretty big increases. So I think I would imagine Cameron County will probably be okay once we're doing this for tax year. Once we see the 23 property value study from the controller's office. Okay, so that's how to use. So we talked about using your CAD data to figure out what your tax rate is going to be because of compression. We talked about how to use your CAD data to estimate what your T value is going to be, your T2 primarily, for purposes of plugging into your template and calculating recapture or state aid. The next thing is the easiest one, is to calculate tax collections. This will rely on a couple different data points from your report. We're gonna use those freeze adjusted values and the frozen taxes paid. We may look at the ARB losses, the appraisal review board losses, if we're seeing a big difference there. All right. So we are, here's how those things kind of fit together. Another one of my wonderful formulas here. This one's not too bad though. You look at the M&O freeze adjusted taxable, which I'll show you where to find that, I think. Yeah, right here. So here's back to your CAD report. Down at the bottom, so we talked about net taxable earlier. You needed that for T2 and for the compression. For collections, you're going to skip down and look at the freeze adjusted. This district has 313, so there's M&O and INS freeze adjusted. But if you don't have a 313, you're just going to see freeze adjusted net taxable. So you'll find that number for if we're doing M&O collections, you'll do M&O. Plug that in here, divide by 100 times your rate that you figured out once you did all the compression stuff I just talked about. The next data point you need is your frozen actual tax total. Again, the place to find that, do I show you? I don't show you. But you can see it down here. It's actual tax. We looked at it earlier. There's this actual tax table. This is what your frozen over 65 and disabled homeowners are going to pay. So you pluck that data point from your report. Most CADs, the way they divvy this up is by the rate, right? So they look at your M&O tax rate as a fraction of your total tax rate. Okay, if 90% of your tax rate is M&O, then 90% of the frozen collections gets called M&O collections. 10% will get called INS collections. Okay, so that's what this formula is doing. It's saying what percentage of your tax rate is M&O? Okay, that percentage of your frozen collections gets attributed to the M&O. If you have a 313, then you got to make sure to adjust for that, use the limited property values. So then once you do your levy, then you can, it's just a hop, skip, and a jump over to collections. You take your levy, do your collection rate, whatever you guys think that is. You know, some districts usually pick something from 95% to 98%, somewhere in there. So that's your current year collections plus delinquent tax collections, whatever estimate you want to have there. And there you go. Now you have an M&O collections ready to go for your template. INS is the same story. Just make sure if you're a 313 to choose that INS freeze adjusted values. You still grab that frozen actual tax, but we only want to put in the INS portion of that So we take INS rate divided by total tax rate. That gets us a percentage that we then apply to the frozen actual tax total. Everything else is the same though. Take the INS levy, collection rate, whatever assumption you want to make there, plus whatever delinquent INS tax collection assumption you want to make. That, my friends, is how to take your CAD report that you're going to get at the end of July and sort of convert that to template-friendly data points that you can use to project your revenues.